see lots of people from exciting to see lots of people from the Reno area. I was in Reno, working at the university there before I came here to Tooele. So my goal today is to talk about bees, as we know, but I want to dispel some myths about bees. So I have several quizzes on here. I usually give this quiz to everybody that I ask. This is on a scale of 1 to 5. How important are bees? 5 means they are really important. 1 means they're not important. So you can just put that in the chat, and I expect I know the answer. When I do this in person, I just have people hold their hands up. 5 is good, 1 is bad. And I did this across the country. I actually did a big online survey about what people know about bees. And as we see from the chat here, 99% of people think bees are important. There's this weird artifact with surveys that there's always somebody that is answering the way you don't expect. So I don't know who the 1% is that doesn't think bees are important, but so on a scale of 1 to 5, people think bees are important. That's good because it means that as a conservation biologist, I don't have to convince people that this organism is a valuable organism. But the problem is that people really don't know what that means when we say bees are important. So let's talk about this idea. A lot of people want to save the bees, and that's a great idea. Here, I'm going to move my face out of the way on this screen. Sorry, you can't see it, but I can. A lot of people want to save the bees. They have various ideas about what that means. When I periodically will just put into a Google image search, save the bees to see what I find. These are 2 examples. This is from the same artist. So the one on the left says, save the bees, save humanity. The one on the right, 30% of our food is pollinated by bees, and they're wanting people to save the bees. Anyone know what's wrong with these pictures? Because there is something wrong with them. And I'll just let you think about it. I won't wait for the answers necessarily. And I see that some people are correct. That one on the left, save the bees to save humanity, that's actually not a picture of a bee. That's a picture of a yellow jacket wasp. Nobody says save the yellow jackets to save humanity. On the right, there's another problem. So yes, it is the same dead yellow jacket wasp in this picture. But the other thing wrong with this, as Meredith says in the chat, this is corn, and corn is not pollinated by bees. It is a wind-pollinated plant like all of our grains are. So when people are not informed about bees, they can make mistakes when they're trying to help save the bees. And it's not just random artists on the internet that make these mistakes. There's lots of mistakes that get perpetuated. Here's another few examples I found from the internet. This is from some company called Simply Organic. I don't know what they are, but it says celebrating World Bee Day with intelligent nutrients. The problem with this is that is not a picture of a bee over here on the right. That is a picture of a fly. So celebrating World Bee Day with a picture of a fly. On the left, we have a photoshopped picture of Einstein. It says, if the bee disappears from the surface of the earth, man would have no more than 4 years to live. This is a quote that, quote unquote, quote, that people say Einstein said. The problem is Einstein, first of all, he was not a biologist and he was not a bee researcher. He was a theoretical physicist. There's no evidence that he ever had anything to do with bees, and there's no evidence that he ever said any quote like this. Einstein was not into predicting disappearance of organisms and how long Earth would survive. That's just a weird thing to say. It's kind of like saying, if all the fresh water on Earth dried up tomorrow, what would happen? It's like, that's not something that happens. And if bees disappeared from the surface of the Earth, that means something bigger is going on. It's not like something that happens overnight. So let's talk about what a bee is. People want to save the bees. People want to spread memes about bees, but they are confused about what that means. So I have a quiz for you. Some of these are bees, some of them are not bees. What I generally do is I'll pretend we are in person because Zoom is kind of like in person. I will just go through each of these and I'm going to say number 1. If you think it's a bee, write in the chat or say to yourself, yes, it's a bee. If you think it's not a bee, just say no. So this is a yes or no quiz. So I'm going to go through these. Number 1, is it a bee? Number 2, is it a bee? Okay, good. People are doing good so far. Number 3, is it a bee? We are on number 3. Okay, it's getting mixed answers. Number 4, is number 4 a bee? Very good. People are doing great in the chat. I'm just browsing as it's going through. Number 5, is number 5 a bee? Okay, excellent. Number 6. Good. Number 7. Love it. Number 7. Okay, number 8, is number 8 a bee? This is working great on the chat. You guys are doing good. Number 9, bottom middle, is number 9 a bee? Okay, and then number 10. Number 10. I'm just watching the chats roll through. So it's interesting. What happens in person when I do this? Everyone starts off really strong. Everyone yells out no for number one, because number one is a fly. Number two, everyone says yes. So people are kind of on a roll. Then when we start getting to number five and six and seven, instead of people saying yes or no, they just kind of stop talking. And I couldn't tell if the chat was slowing down when we get to five or six, but some people are confident about certain organisms on this page of what are bees, and then people get less confident as we go on. So these are the bees here. Many of you did very well, and I saw some mixed answers, especially with things like number seven and number 10. People don't often associate shiny blue insects as being bees. They think of them more as flies. So there are lots of things that are bees that are not recognized as bees. And then many people say number nine looks like a bee. It's orange and black and fuzzy, but it's missing a key characteristic of a bee, which is wings. This is a velvet ant, the coolest wasp in the world, but that's for another day. That's one of the insects I studied during my PhD up in Logan. So what is a bee? People think of a lot of things when they think of bees, and I want to start here by talking about the differences between bees and these other organisms. On this slide here, the only bee on here is the one on the bottom right. All these other things are not bees. So let's start by talking about flies. There are lots of kinds of flies that look like bees, and there are some easy ways to tell flies apart from bees. Flies are insects, but they are distant cousins from bees. So there's lots of physical differences. Normally, I would have you guys list some physical differences you see here. Maybe let's try that. So on the left is a fly. What do you see that's different between that fly and the bee on the right? And I'll just watch the chat for some thoughts you have. Someone says antenna. That's a good observation. We'll talk about that. Big eyes, one pair of wings, no hairs, slick body and legs, one set of wings. These are all really good. So when I tell my kids are interested in bugs like me because that's what we do for family vacations. I tell them you can tell if it's a fly with two main characteristics. I say look at the head and look at the legs. And we'll talk about the wings too. But so first, the short antennas. These flies, especially the ones that look like bees, have really short antennas. Bees have longer antennas. Flies, especially the ones that look like bees, have really big eyes. That eye is basically filling half of its head. The bees' eyes are smaller in proportion to their head. Um, Flies only have two wings. Bees have four wings. Now, that is a true characteristic, and I see many of you mentioned it. The problem is when bees are flying and when flies are flying, it's hard to count their wings. And when bees and flies are landed, it's hard to count their wings because bees fold their wings over each other. So that it's a true characteristic. Bees have four, flies have two. It's hard to tell though. The other one is flies have skinny legs. A lot of you notice these are skinny, not very hairy legs. And the bees have really hairy legs. And even when they're not as hairy, like these front two legs, they're still kind of fat. Overall, this bee is much fuzzier than the fly. The fly has a little bit of fuzz. But so those are some good characteristics between bees and flies. Now I have a quiz for you. On the left, is that a bee or is that a fly? And I'll just watch the chat again. Okay, so we're looking at the one on the left, and people are getting it right. It is a fly. It has those short antennas. It has the big eyes. It has the skinny legs. It's not very hairy. Okay, one more. Oh, wait, I have arrows pointing to that. So you guys did well. One more quiz. This is a little bit trickier. On the left, is this a bee or is this a fly? And so what generally happens is people look at the hairy body, they look at those kind of fatter, hairy legs, and they look at the way the wings are folded, and they say, oh, that looks like a bee. But then they stop themselves and they say, oh, look at the face, though. The face has those big eyes and those short antennas. And this is indeed a fly. You guys did very well. This is called a robber fly. It's actually a predator. It will catch bees or other insects out of the air and stab its mouth into them and suck their guts out. But it does look a lot like a bee, so birds won't attack it. Very cool fly. Okay, so if you look at the face of this fly, it tells us, yes, that is a fly. So I consider us now experts. You guys know the difference between bees and flies. Look at the head, look at the legs, you can do it. But what about wasps? So I mentioned bees and flies are distant relatives. Bees and wasps are close relatives. So physically, there are not as many easy characteristics to tell bees apart from wasps. If we look at this picture, we have the same bee on the bottom right, and I put three wasps on here. Many people will notice these wasps look less hairy. That is true. Wasps often have skinny waists. You can see this one on the bottom left has a very skinny waist, but these other ones also have skinny waists. They have skinny legs. Let's see what else I put on here. Skinny legs, and the legs are often kind of thorny looking. You can see all of these wasps have kind of spiky legs. Excuse me. Sometimes people will say wasps look mean and bees look nice. I agree with that sentiment. These wasps look kind of mean and the bees look fuzzy and nice, right? So here are some characteristics of wasps that works pretty well. The wings look a little bit different, but the antennas are both long and there are some similarities. So let's look at the legs, the skinny waist, and the not very hairy. We'll use that for our wasp characteristics, and here is a wasp quiz now. On the left, is it a bee or a wasp? People are getting looks waspy, right? It's skinny waist, it's not very hairy, skinny thorny legs. How about this one on the left? Bee or a wasp? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of people suggesting wasp in the chat because based on our characteristics, that looks like a wasp. But I tricked you. That is actually a bee on the left. And you might be thinking, wait a second, but you just told me all these wasp characteristics and it fits this insect here. There are actually a lot of bees that look very waspy. A lot of them have very little hair or they have skinny, kind of thorny looking legs. So what do? Bees and wasps are hard to tell apart physically. There is one physical characteristic. So if we look at this bee in the middle here, if we zoom in on that bee's shoulder, you can see around this little plate on the shoulder, we zoom in on that, and you can see these specialized little hairs that look like little feathers. We call these plumose hairs. So every kind of bee somewhere on his body has plumose hairs. Now I'm going to go back for a second. You can also see some plumose hairs here on the abdomen or on the back of the thorax and around that shoulder area. The problem is no one can look this close. This bee is about 1/4 of an inch long, and we're having to look really close at that bee to see the plumose hairs on it. So it's not a very useful characteristic, even though it is true. So physically, they're hard to tell apart, but there is a ecological difference between bees and wasps. That difference is their diet. Bees are herbivores. They eat pollen and nectar and feed their babies pollen and nectar. Wasps are mostly carnivores. They feed their babies meat, and when I say meat, I mean mostly insects. So wasps are hunters, bees are foragers. This is a picture of a wasp. It has killed a katydid in my driveway. It is now taking balls of katydid guts out to go bring back to its nest to feed to its babies. So this ecological difference contributes to some of the physical differences that we see. Bees are often hairier, that helps them gather and collect pollen. Wasps are often less hairy with spiky legs because that helps them in their hunting. I do see in the chat someone says, what about fig pollinating wasps? And so when I'm saying wasps, that's actually a huge category. Wasps are split into two main groups. There's the stinging wasps and the non-stinging wasps. Most of us think of stinging wasps as wasps, and that's what I'm kind of talking about. But this whole other group of primitive wasps are parasitoids. So they don't sting with their stinger, they lay eggs with their stinger, and those are these parasites like fig wasps and their relatives. Many of them will lay eggs inside of other insects, so they're really important for pest control and things like that, but they're not the stinging wasps that we think of. And often they don't really look the same as wasps. Sometimes you'll see these wasps with very, very long, quote, stingers out their back and they're flying around the forest. Those are actually not stingers, they're egg layers, but they are officially a kind of primitive wasp. And there's tons of diversity, millions and millions of species of these. Okay, so we have bees versus flies. We have bees versus wasps. We are now experts, so let's talk about bees. I put some bee facts in here, and I put quotes around bee facts. Most people, when they think about bees, these are some of the characteristics they think of. Bees live in hives, there are queen and worker bees make honey, and bees are good pollinators. These facts about bees are decent facts for this bee in this picture right here. This is a European honeybee. What most people don't realize is that the European honeybee is not like most other kinds of bees. For example, this bee on the left is called a fairy bee. It's one of 600 species in North America, and it doesn't look or act or behave like a European honeybee. So let's look at these bee facts again and recognize that honeybees, which these facts are based on, honeybees are actually the black sheep of the bee world. In case you're wondering what that is a black sheep flying into the screen. Black sheep doesn't mean it's bad. I'll get that was a sheep joke. I said bad. Black sheep are not bad. They're just different than other sheep. Honeybees are not necessarily bad, but they are different than most other bees. So let's talk about these bee characteristics and contrast honeybees with other bees. I'm often going to call these other bees wild bees. Honeybees are not necessarily wild. These other bees almost exclusively are wild. And we can talk more about that later on. But so this idea that bees live in hives, we've learned this depending on your generation from various cartoon bears. And these hives are often depicted as these kind of paper mache bags. And they are up in trees and there's honey comes out of it. You usually get your friend to come get the honey out of it, like Piglet here. So, do bees live in paper mache bags on trees? The answer is no. In fact, no bees around the world live in these paper mache bags. You might think to yourself, well, I've been hiking and I've seen these paper mache bags. I actually took this photo on the top left out in the hills by Reno. So, what are these paper bags you see? Or sometimes people say, hey, I have a beehive under my deck. It's like a paper honeycomb. In fact, both of these paper nests are wasp nests. Broadly, we call them paper wasps. The ones that make these enclosed nest with a big paper mache bag around it are some kinds of yellow jackets or bald-faced hornets, which is this black one, bald-faced hornet, and this yellow jacket. If you look close here, you can see a yellow jacket at the bottom of this hive. These ones that make the open, kind of honeycomb-looking paper nests are broadly called paper wasps. This is a European paper wasp. They are invasive across the US, and they are the ones that are in most of our yards. There are native paper wasps too. But so there are no kinds of bees anywhere in the world that make paper nests. Wasps are the ones that make paper, and they make it just like us. They chew up, well, we don't chew it, but they grind up wood pulp and mix it with water and then create paper out of that. So where do bees live? Well, we've heard that they live in hives. Most honeybees around the world live in man-made hives. They're these boxes and they have different layers in them and they can make their waxy combs in there. But most bees do not live in hives, whether that's these paper ones or these boxy ones. Most bees, in fact, in the world, about 70 to 80% of bees are solitary ground nesting bees. So solitary means a single bee lives by herself. Ground nesting, they nest in the ground. So a female bee will dig a hole in the ground. That is her nest. There's no hive, there's no queen, there's no workers, there's no honey involved. Just a single female bee digging a hole in the ground. Sometimes bees will find a patch of soil that they like a lot, and they will make kind of a neighborhood of solitary ground nesting bees. This is a kind of bee often called a mallow bee, or sometimes it's called a digger bee, sometimes it's called a chimney bee. Each of these little chimneys is the entrance to a nest. Each bee only has one entrance to her nest, and because they like this patch of ground, they nest in an aggregation, kind of like a neighborhood. Underneath that entrance, there's a straight tunnel that goes down, and then they have a couple branches off for each little room. The room is like a nursery. In each room, they put pollen and nectar in there, lay an egg, and then seal it up. That is how the vast majority of bees live around the world, solitary ground nesting bees. Now, there are other solitary bees that aren't necessarily ground nesting. We call them solitary cavity nesting bees. This bee here is called a leafcutter bee. She finds a pre-existing cavity, whether that's in a rock or a hole in a tree, and she will bring cut pieces of leaves to use kind of like wallpaper. Then she lines that hole with these cut pieces of leaves to make little rooms, little nurseries again. She fills the nursery with pollen and nectar and lays an egg. And that right here, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but on the bottom right, that is a baby bee. It looks like a maggot. Someone asks, are there ground nesting wasps? And yes, there are. There are hundreds of species of ground nesting wasps, and even some of those yellow jackets will make nests underground. But lots of the solitary wasps also nest in the ground. Things like sand wasps or spider wasps or other specialized hunting wasps. So we have the ground nesting bees, we have these cavity nesting bees. The female bees are the only ones that are participating in this nesting behavior. So the female bee digs the nest in the ground, or this female bee is bringing pieces of leaves to manipulate her nest in the hollow piece of wood. What do male bees do? Well, male bees have one job, and that is to mate with female bees. Once they have done their job, they fly around and drink nectar, and that is their life. They have nowhere to sleep because they don't participate in nesting. So many male bees will sleep in flowers. This is in the early morning. This is a male bee, the same species as those ones that make the chimneys over their nests. He is emerging out of the flower in the morning where he spent the night. Sometimes you see other male bees that will bite onto a twig, or in this case, a piece of grass, and they will stay there for the night. They just lock their jaws onto that and sleep for the night. In the morning, they all fly off. Sometimes you see these aggregations of male bees sleeping. It's especially common in the fall in the sunflowers. If you look inside a sunflower in the evening or in the early morning, you'll see these long-horned bees sleeping inside a sunflower. So most bees are solitary. Moral of the story. Next fact about bees is that bees eat honey. We've learned that from the same cartoon bears that told us where bees live. This fact is only true for one species of bee in North America. That species of bee is the European honeybee. It's not even from North America. So if bees don't eat honey, and when I say North America, I mean biogeographically north, so north of kind of central Mexico. When you get into the tropics, there are native tropical stingless bees that do make a honey-like substance, but it's different than the European honeybee. So what do bees eat if they don't eat honey? Well, we've already talked about this. Bees eat pollen and nectar. So as adults, they eat pollen and nectar, and as larvae, they eat pollen and nectar. But something kind of interesting fact about this dietary preferences that these wild bees have, many people don't realize that most bees, well, not most, many bees are picky eaters. We call these specialists. So this is a little video. I don't remember if there's sound on it, but I will narrate it. So this bee here is called a squash bee. It is a specialist pollinator of squash plants. That includes wild squash, like coyote squash, which lives down in the Mojave and Sonoran deserts. But up here, this is in my backyard. They visit my pumpkins and my zucchinis and my yellow squash, things like that. So this is a squash bee. The female bee is a specialist, so she only collects pollen from squash flowers. You can see she's foraging around the bottom of this squash flower. You see pollen on her legs and on her body. Then she takes a break to clean that pollen from her face and from her legs, and she's going to move that pollen to her back legs so she can bring it back to her nest. In a second, a male squash bee comes along. He doesn't collect pollen and nectar. He just wants to mate. So he attempts to mate with this female. She is not interested, so they wrestle around a little bit, and the male flies off. So you'll see the male come here, right somewhere here. There's the male, tries to mate, she's not interested, and they fly away. So the male doesn't take the time to clean himself in between these explorations from flower to flower looking for females. So it turns out that male squash bees actually transfer more pollen between male and female flowers than the female squash bees, because the males are just flying around haphazardly looking for females to mate with. Squash bees are active the same times of day as the squash flowers. So they come out early in the morning, right at dawn, and they'll stay active until about 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning when the squash flowers start to close up. Male squash bees, like all bees, don't participate in nesting, so they actually sleep in those buds of the flowers. If you go out to your squash or zucchini or pumpkin plants and you squeeze those little flower buds, you can feel the buzz of the male squash bees that are sleeping inside there. So they are specialists. That means that if you don't plant zucchini next year, the squash bees that are nesting in the ground below that zucchini patch will come out, and there's no zucchini for them. So they don't just change their mind and say, I guess I'll eat dandelions this year. They actually are programmed to only see squash as a food source. So they will disperse and look for new squash patches nearby. They can fly several miles in these dispersal events to try to find somewhere where there's food for them. Because if there's no squash, there's no food for them. That's what their brain tells them. So there's a question as I introduce this idea of wild bees and that they're not quite like honeybees. A lot of people often say, well, do they pollinate? Hopefully you're not thinking that, because I just showed you a squash bee pollinating. But let's go through some of these statistics about wild bees pollinating. The answer is yes, they pollinate, and in some cases, they're very excellent pollinators. So studies have shown that the pollination in an apple orchard that 100 honeybees can do, so this is 100 honeybees, 100 honeybees can do the same amount of pollination as 2 of these wild bees that are called mason bees. There's lots of factors involved with this. Some of it's because of the temperature that the wild bees fly versus the honeybees. Some of it's the behavior on the flower of the wild bees and the honeybees. But that is a huge difference, 100 honeybees or 2 of these wild mason bees. One of the things that wild bees can do that makes them good pollinators is this thing called buzz pollination. Can anyone guess what this flower is? This is a very zoomed in version of the flower. I just want to see if anyone knows it, since there's lots of people. Oh, look at that. You guys are excellent. This is a tomato flower. So tomatoes and their relatives have these unique kinds of flowers. So tomatoes, tomatillos, eggplants, stuff like that, potatoes. They hold on to their pollen is not easily accessible. In this tomato flower, the pollen is inside this little center part. Honeybees don't pollinate tomatoes because they don't know how to get the tomato pollen out. Many wild bees have this ability to do something called buzz pollination. So this is not a tomato, it's a tomatillo flower. Same process happens though. This is a wild bee on my tomatillo flowers, and I just have this little video. So she's foraging around. She's going to turn around all the way, and then I slow the video down right here, and she actually vibrates her body, and you can see pollen falling out of this tomatillo flower. It falls out onto her belly, then she moves that onto her legs and flies away. Studies have shown you get bigger tomatoes and more tomatoes per plant when you have buzz pollinators. Same is true for blueberries. You have more blueberries in your blueberry bushes when you have buzz pollinators. Bumblebees are famous for buzz pollination, but other bees like this is called a cellophane bee, are also buzz pollinators. Honeybees don't have this ability. They have never evolved it. Many bees will actually vibrate their wing muscles without flapping their wings, and that causes the pollen to fall out. So wild bees are cool. Hopefully you're getting some of this. Some other fun facts about bees. In the eastern United States, I'm defining eastern United as east of the Mississippi River, and I'll say eastern North America, so US and Canada. Some studies have shown there's about 770 bee species. That's a lot of different kinds of bees in the east. I recently did a study of bees in Utah, that's where I'm located, and we have over 1,100 different bee species just in Utah. Colorado has published one with 900 and something. Washington recently published one with almost 600. Oregon is estimating to have over six or 700. We're working on one from Nevada, but we're not done, but there's at least 900 species there. So bees are more diverse in desert and Mediterranean areas. This is true worldwide. So we have more kinds of bees in Utah than a similar sized area would have in the tropics. We think of most diversity in animals and plants as highest in the tropics and lower as you get farther north. That is less true for bees. Bees are most diverse in the desert and Mediterranean parts of the world. That could be related to because some of their nesting preferences. There's more diversity of soils and drier soils, which makes more nesting habitats for them in these kind of dry and Mediterranean areas. Also, plant diversity is there's different kinds of microhabitats, I guess we can say, in some of these dry desert areas. Okay, so shifting gears, what do wild bees need? We now know that there is a difference between wild bees and honeybees, and wild bees, like all organisms, need shelter and resources, so food and habitat. What does that mean for wild bees? Well, food is fairly easy. Food equals flowers. So when I say flowers, I'm talking about a variety of flowers. I encourage people to plant different colors and sizes and shapes of flowers. Generally, the rule of thumb is native flowers are better for native bees. They have evolved together for thousands of years and they have tight relationships. But there's interesting studies that show in some parts of the world a mixture of native flowers and non-native flowers can actually support more pollinators. For example, in Utah, I'm in northern Utah, in July, there's not a lot of native flowers that are blooming. So if I planted exclusively native flowers, my July garden would not be supporting very many bees. So you can plant native flowers mixed with some non-natives, like this is Russian sage behind that purple in the picture on the right. And you can support lots of kinds of bees. So different sizes, shapes, colors. Also an important thing to think about is there are different bees in the spring than there are in the late summer. So you want spring blooming flowers and summer blooming flowers and fall blooming flowers. There's a question here, are dandelions not very nutritious for bees, like candy versus a vegetable? And it's tricky. Dandelions, a lot of bees do visit dandelions. There is some research that shows that a bee fed exclusively dandelion pollen does not have as maybe you could say as complete of a diet as bees that are being fed a variety of pollen sources. However, those bees that are visiting dandelions are not native to North America. The bees that are visiting them usually are not exclusively visiting dandelions. Um, so dandelions can be a good resource for bees, but they should not be the only resource for bees. You see online, especially in the spring, something about leaving your dandelions because they help bees in the spring. They might help them some. I often suggest to people native shrubs. Many of our native shrubs, especially here in the West, bloom early in the spring. Willow is a great resource for early spring bees. Maples are a good resource for early spring bees, and several other early blooming flowers that we have that are native here. So I am not totally opposed to dandelions, but dandelions are not the answer to creating healthy bee habitat. We need to be more purposeful about that. Um, oh, I see another one. Service berries are also great in the early spring for bees, which are native to the West. Okay, quiz for you. Not all flowers are equal. I said flowers are good for bees, but not all flowers are equally good for bees. I have flower on the left and a flower on the right. I've labeled them 1 and 2. Which of these two flowers do you think are better for bees? These are two kinds of sunflowers. Okay, so far I see mostly ones, and those of you that are saying flower number 1 is better for bees are correct. Flower number 1 is one of these native sunflowers that grow on the roadsides in the West. Flower number 2 is a hybrid cultivated variety of sunflower. It has more ray petals, and I think specifically this one is called a pollenless sunflower because they've hybridized it to make less pollen, so it looks better for like bouquets and things like that. I specifically chose these two flowers because there was a study that planted both of these flowers next to each other, and they found way more wild bees on these native sunflowers. An interesting rule of thumb for this is the flowers that are often cultivars that we are putting into nurseries or for like flower festivals and stuff, many of them have more ray petals than their wild counterparts. So you can see in this sunflower lots of rows of ray petals, which makes it really pretty. This wild sunflower just has that one row of ray petals. Same thing with daisies. Wild daisies versus something like a Gerbera daisy has 2 rows of ray petals. So one more quiz. Those were sunflowers you guys passed. On this quiz, we have 2 kinds of rows. Which one is better for bees? You guys are pros. On the left, we have one of these roses from like a rose garden. On the right, we have what we call a wild rose. Lots of bees visit the wild rose, so number 2 is correct. I have only ever seen one bee on these cultivated roses, and it was actually just sleeping inside it. It wasn't collecting pollen. So I'm not saying don't plant roses, but just know if you want to plant a bee-friendly garden, rose flowers, I mean, these cultivated roses that look really pretty, they're not part of a bee-friendly garden, but they are pretty and they smell nice. So consider that when you're thinking about it. One plant that a lot of people are getting into when they're planting pollinator gardens that I wanted just to mention here is milkweed. So I was curious about this. So milkweed, they're mostly planting for this one insect on the left. This is a monarch butterfly. On the bottom left, this is a monarch caterpillar. Monarch caterpillars only eat milkweed. So milkweed is very important for monarchs. Monarchs have been in steep decline over the last 40 years, partially because in our agricultural landscapes, milkweed, which used to be a big part of these field margins, has often been killed with herbicides to kind of make it so they're not too weedy. So monarchs have been in decline. So people are planting milkweed for monarchs. I asked the question, well, what bees visit milkweed? So I did surveys here in Utah, and then I looked at the literature and other online databases and stuff around the country. And I found that there's over 280 different bee species that are known to visit milkweed. However, of these 280 bee species, the vast majority of them are only visiting it for nectar. Milkweed has a weird pollination biology. They keep their pollen in these little sacs, the pollinia, rather than loose pollen. So the bees that are visiting milkweed are using it for a nectar source. That's like their carbohydrate energy drink, but they're not yet necessarily using it for pollen. So if your pollinator garden only has milkweed, you're missing part of the diet that bees need. Okay, so we've talked about what bees need for food. What about for shelter? We know that the majority of bees nest in the ground, so we need to leave some ground for bees. Now, this is a tricky ask for many homeowners or people planting pollinator gardens because bare ground often equals weeds, but bare ground is what ground nesting bees prefer. What I've tried to do in my yard, this is a picture of my yard from several years ago, is instead of putting mulch or ground cloth or weed barrier between my flowers, I used a drip irrigation system and then left bare dirt around it. And these ground nesting bees were nesting in that bare dirt. Not everyone can leave bare dirt. If you're watering with sprinklers, that's a little bit harder. But this is something I've tried more recently. So I did put mulch down to keep the weeds down, but then I isolated certain patches of bare dirt using this kind of landscaping borders to try to tell the bees, hey, nest in this bare dirt, and then I can still do my mulch to try to keep weeds down. It kind of has worked and it kind of has not worked. I do have bees nesting in this big square one. I don't yet have bees nesting in these two circle ones. Mostly the cats think that they're litter boxes, which I do not like. Um, so habitat for ground nesting bees means they need some bare dirt. Sometimes this just means leaving dirt between flagstones in your driveway or in your walkway and bees will nest there. They're pretty flexible. Some bees will nest almost anywhere. Other bees are really picky about the soil type. So a diversity of soils is beneficial. The cavity nesting bees, though, need cavities to nest in. In our urban and suburban landscapes, we no longer have dead trees that we leave in people's yards. When a tree dies, we cut it down. In nature, these solitary cavity nesting bees nest in those dead trees, often in abandoned beetle burrows or other cavities in those trees. Because we have taken away all of that nesting sites, it can be beneficial, especially in urban and suburban areas, to create bee nesting boxes. I call these bee hotels because it makes sense to me. There's different ways to do this. On the left, I just drilled holes in a block of wood. On the right, this is a commercial store-bought bee nesting box. Sometimes these don't work very well, the commercial ones, because sometimes the diameter of the hole is too big. But the idea here is a variety of diameters will attract a variety of bees. In my yard, I've had the best luck by making a bee hotel out of reeds. This is a bundle of reeds that I've cut to be about 8 inches long, and this is a leafcutter bee nesting in it. In these bee hotels, you also get friendly wasps that nest in them. This is called a grass-carrying wasp. It hunts tree crickets, which look like little mini katydids. It will paralyze the tree cricket, shove it into one of those holes and lay an egg on it, and then it uses dead grass to kind of insulate that hole. So you'll get many kinds of bees that nest in these bee hotels. The reeds that I prefer to use are, and I'll play this video so you can see the bee looking for its nest. I use Phragmites. Phragmites is very invasive and it's found all over the place. And so I'll chop it down and cut the seed head off and destroy it. And then I'll use those reeds for my bee nest box. We all learned during COVID that social distancing is important for reducing the spread of disease. Now, this is true for every kind of disease, right? If you have a cold, stay away from people and you will reduce the spread of a cold. What we have done with these bee hotels is we have reduced the natural social distancing that these wild pollinators will normally experience. When there's a dead tree, you usually get random holes from abandoned beetle burrows that are anywhere from 6 inches apart to 3 feet apart. In this bee hotel, we have congregated their nests close together. So parasites and pathogens will spread quickly through bee hotels. If we just leave them there constantly. Some people suggest creating new bee hotels every few years to reduce the spread of parasites. I usually take a couple of years off between bee hotels. Also, instead of doing hundreds of reeds together like I have here, usually smaller bundles of reeds, maybe 10 to 20 reeds, will make it so we're not reducing the social distancing quite as much. Excuse me, I see someone saying they've been drilling holes in dead trees along the river. That can be a great way to provide those cavity nests for cavity nesting bees. I already said Phragmites. So how do we save the bees? Well, I often tell people you can't save something you don't know anything about. So to save the bees, we first need to get to know the bees. And that's part of what this presentation is about, to encourage you to get to know the bees. One thing I want to kind of nail into your heads is this idea that some people are offended by, but I stand by it. I think we should think of honeybees as cattle. Honeybees are an important agricultural commodity. Excuse me, they're not native to North America. Cattle are also an important agricultural commodity, and they also are not native to North America. Nobody goes up to Yellowstone and on their way stops off the side of the road to take pictures of cows. Well, not that many people do. Similar, because cows are not wild animals. Honeybees, while they are important agriculturally, they are not wild animals either, and they don't necessarily need the focus of our attention. Wild bees do need support, but what kind of support do they need? You often see online people say we should make these bee watering troughs because pollinators need water. And so they say put marbles in a dish of water like this, and it will help pollinators. that dish is only useful for honeybees. Honeybees and some wasps will visit it to drink water, but wild bees do not. This is similar to cows. Cows also often need supplemental water. And so cows and honeybees both thrive in wild environments when they have support from humans. This is also true in reproduction. Honeybees, their hive is most healthy when they are under the care of beekeepers. Cattle, if any of you have worked with cattle, they do best when they are under the care of cattle people. This is, in case you're wondering what this picture is, this person is helping this cow give birth. Kind of helping, right? But so they do best when they are tended by humans. Honeybees do best when they are tended by humans. So we know, we as humans, we know if there are too many cows in an area, it is bad for that environment. Um, and so we have strict regulations for how many cows can be in different forest lands or public lands, and there's regulations about it. We as humans have not made the same recognition of honeybees. That is changing. There are lots of studies suggesting that too many honeybees in an area has a very negative effect on wild bees. Sometimes that's direct competition. Often it's the wild bees change their behavior when there's too many honeybees around. So what do wild bees need? Well, wild bees need habitat. Wild habitat is best for wild bees, but we can kind of adjust even our front yard to have some characteristics of the wild habitat, like native flowers, like some wild areas for them to nest. Um, so we need to be aware of these pollinators and learn about them so we can try to meet their habitat needs. Now, here's where I plug my own stuff because that's what you do in these kinds of talks. I want you to be aware of bee diversity. There are books that me and Olivia, my friend, have written. Bees in Your Backyard is a broad introduction to all the different kinds of bees in the US and Canada. After that book, we did 2 field guides. This one is Eastern United States. So we did east of the Rocky Mountains because that's where the bees kind of make their big faunal distinction. And then Western bees is west of the Rocky Mountains. I never said, but there are 4,000 kinds of bees in North America. We do not have all 4,000 kinds in either of these field guides. We chose common or interesting bees from these areas, but it's like a field guide like you would use for birds. It has identification tips and helps you kind of figure out what bee you are looking at. I also wrote a kid's book with an illustrator friend of mine. Bees are the best, and this is the story about the main character is a honeybee. She thinks bees are awesome because they're like her. She goes out into the real world and meets a bunch of other kinds of bees that aren't like her. They don't live in a hive, they don't make honey, and it changes her worldview, and she thinks, well, maybe bees aren't the best. And then she realizes bees are the best because they're all different, not because they're all like her. Then at the end of the book, we have fun facts about the characters in the book. So that was my little plug. Here are some social media that sometimes I maintain, sometimes I don't. Right now, social media is messy, so I haven't posted very much on it, but you're welcome to follow some of that stuff if you want. And I don't even know what time it is, but we probably have time for questions. Yep,
Thank
it is.
you. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah.
I'm gonna